have called him a right-wing philosopher. Some say that he's in favor of bringing back a monarchy. Well, that's an interesting cat. That's Curtis Yarvin, and we're going to talk to him right now, and we'll find out for ourselves. So Curtis used to be known as Mencius Moldbug on his old blog, Unqualified Reservations, but he is now at Gray Mirror. That's his own Substack. Curtis, welcome.
All right, it's a pleasure to be on your show, Cenk.
All right, God bless. So ironic. First, let's start with why you've been in the news recently. So folks like Peter Thiel, who's a right-wing billionaire in Silicon Valley, Blake Masters, who's running for Senate in Arizona, and JD Vance, running for Senate in Ohio, have praised you, have mentioned your work, and there's been reports that you guys hang out. So let's just discuss that for a second, then we'll get to your ideas. I'm super curious to see if you really do believe in a monarchy, et cetera, and why. But is it true? Are you? I don't know how you would characterize yourself. Are you friends with those guys?
Do I hang out? I mean, have I? Yeah, I've met them. I'm very sure that I believe many things that they don't believe in. I would say these are people with very open and broad minds, and I'd like to think that any of them would be happy to come on the Young Turks. Maybe I'm wrong, but I'm super into just taking a lot of the dialogue between people who are not necessarily fans of the way things work now and kind of synthesizing those things into kind of new perspectives.
Yeah, well, look, we'd love to have him on. I am not as hopeful at the opportunity.
I'm obviously not. I don't speak for them.
Yeah, I hear you.
I think it'd be a great idea.
And Curtis, is it fair to say? Yeah, sorry. Go ahead. Finish your thought.
No, go ahead. Is it fair to say?
Yeah. Is it fair to say? Look, you've met them. They've quoted you positively, but that doesn't mean you speak for them or they speak for you. You're both individuals.
Absolutely.
Right. Okay.
Absolutely.
And because
absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. And so that's fair. And the mainstream media loves to do smear by association. So I just want to be clear about that. But at the same time, it's not like they're lying. They didn't make it up. You guys have talked.
Yeah. That's exactly right. That's very fair of you, Cenk.
All right.
I think that's exactly the way to talk about that.
Okay.
Do you want to talk about monarchy? Can we get to monarchy?
Yeah, we do. I do. In fact, I disagree with you on almost everything except one giant thing that I do agree on. We're going to get to that in a second. But is monarchy fair? Is it fair to say, as the press has been saying, that you're in favor of a monarchy?
Yes, it's definitely fair. And but the thing is, you have to use the word monarchy in the right way, and literally just use it in its meaning as like, the rule of one. And so I think for most of the Young Turks audience, when they think of monarchy in that sense, they probably go straight to Hitler, maybe Henry VIII, Mussolini, right? That's sort of their picture of the rule of one, and it's certainly true that those people, existed, basically as described. But I think as an American, and especially as a blue state American, proud brown graduate here, New York Jew. I think that the right person to think of when you think of an American monarch is to think of FDR. And when you're looking at FDR, you're looking at someone who really was effectively the CEO of Washington, D.C. I mean, there were, little stubborn pockets of like old guard resistance, and like state and army that kind of defied him to some extent, but he really ran the place. And of course, anyone who's an American progressive, and honestly, most American conservatives, really revere FDR. So when you say America needs a new FDR, you're sounding, I think, a little less controversial. But for you, Cenk, the person that I would love to talk to you about is Mustafa Kemal Ataturk. And so what would you say if I said America needs an Ataturk?
Yeah, I would say that is probably not the appropriate analogy at this point. And so you could make that analogy about George Washington before we got a constitutional form of government. After we got a constitutional form of government, then that analogy falls apart. And I certainly don't think that we need one now.
Well, if you look at the change in the way in what Washington, D.C. went through, between Hoover and FDR, it's almost like a regime change. It's like a different system of government almost has been created on top of the old system. And it was when I try to explain the New Deal to like Silicon Valley people, I'm like, it was like Washington, but it was a startup. And they're just like, what? Like their minds are completely blown by that. Yeah. And this sort of like old, rotting old Washington that I grew up in because my dad was in the Foreign Service. Like I'm a sort of deep state brat. The Washington that I grew up in is kind of the rotting carcass of this amazing, amazing thing that in the 1930s, like literally conquered the frickin' world. And, I think the best example of that I know is my mother worked for many years at DOE, the Department of Energy. And the Department of Energy is literally the successor to the most effective engineering project of all time, government project. You might have heard of it. It was called the Manhattan Project. And, for like my libertarian friends in Silicon Valley, I'm like, well, if the government can't do things right, then explain the Manhattan Project. And, they find that a really hard challenge. But then, when you look at the inside of the Manhattan Project, it ran exactly like a Silicon Valley startup, right down to having the like technical and the non-technical management. So it's just like, it's possible to imagine a Washington that is much, much more effective than the Washington we have now. But it always leads up to having basically a CEO at the top who can effectively reinvent the place. Yeah. And, I think that CEO, one of the things that I was saying recently that really disturbed some of my right-wing fans is I'm like, that CEO, whoever that is who reorganizes this like giant lecherous mess, doesn't have to be, you're like mad at this, Washington because Washington is like terrible for right wingers, right? For red states. There's some animosity there considering as 99% of the people in the deep state are blue staters. But like the real problem is not the animosity. The real problem is that it just sucks. And so, that of it has to be a sort of bipartisan, it has to be something where just by the whole thing, you almost make the red versus blue conflict really go away. And just imagining an America without like any race wars or class wars or culture wars or whatever, it's like, if the price I have to pay for that is like America needs an Ataturk, I'm like, give me Ataturk.
Okay.
How does that feel sound to you, Cenk?
Okay, let me step in. Okay. So we're going to come back to the monarchy, the rule of one, the CEO, president, FDR, et cetera. But I wanted to first make sure that is what you meant, and it's obvious from your answer that it is. And so, it is. But there's nuance there, and I want to come back to it. But I want to start at the beginning with your critique of the system overall. Okay, as you want to un-F the system, as you just said, although probably.
So here's one thing.
Hold on. Let me ask the questions, and then we'll.
I will not try to bully you.
Okay.
I'm sorry.
So you have a critique of the establishment and you call it the cathedral. And that is actually probably a point of agreement that we have. All the things you just said about the monarchy, I don't agree with at all. I want to be clear to the audience and I'll come back to it. But the cathedral, what is it and what's wrong with it? Go ahead.
Excellent question. So I think a lot of your listeners, left and right, would use a phrase like corporate media. And they would say, what's wrong with the corporate media? And they would say, well, it is clear we can start from a universal belief and agreement that like something is stinky here. Can we agree that something is stinky there?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like that there's like a stinky.
We would call it corporate media, and we do think it sucks. So tell us what you think it is.
And let me explain my theory of why it sucks, which is probably different from your theory of why it sucks. A lot of people, when they use the phrase corporate media, are basically referring to kind of a power leakage between the corporate structure and the news desk. And I would say that the one place I think that sort of still runs on this like Daily Planet kind of Superman era kind of model is, of course, the leading newspaper in the world, the New York Times, where I think the Sulzbergers still have some influence. By the way, for everyone out there who considers the New York Times the most reliable source in the world, and it's an amazing, amazing institution, they should note the system of governance that's used at the New York Times. It's actually a 5th generation hereditary monarchy, the Sulzberger family. But in any case, if you basically look at the Times, I do believe what sort of the like Sulzberger barons want is basically reflected in the news desk. If you look at even the Washington Post, which Bezos bought, I don't believe Bezos can tell the news desk what to do at the Post. I don't believe that he's really in charge. I believe that he basically sponsors it rather than owns it. And if the Sulzberger family was somehow to disappear and the New York Times was to say turn into something like ProPublica, I think it would be, which is a completely nonprofit run, top tier journalism outfit, I think it would be fine. I think the way that basically the media, I would call it just the prestige media, which is kind of a neutral term, is corrupted, is a good example might be the COVID lab leak question, which for anyone who on the left who is interested in like unimpeachable left-wing sources on why it's pretty obviously a lab link, I think there were a couple of great stories by I think Catherine Bell in Vanity Fair, and there's a wonderful interview with Nathan J. Robinson, he of the Beautiful Suits, and Jeffrey Sachs. And what happened there from the perspective of the media, and the reason why it sort of took people from outside there to bust it up, is the relationship between journalists and their sources. And so when you're basically reporting on the like life sciences beat, you have a bunch of people that you talk to in the life sciences. They're your sources. They're the people that matter in the civil service. If you mess with these people, they are bigger than you. You are disposable. The New York Times can always find another journalist. There's a lot of people who want to write for the New York Times, whereas somebody who's been with CDC for 20 years is like an emperor. He's like has more job security than Henry VIII, right? And so actually what happens is that these journalists become the prisoners of their sources. So basically when the virology industry does something kind of dumb, like let's go ahead and collect all the bat coronaviruses and then mutate them to be more dangerous in labs in China, which has no quality control, and sort of what you would expect to have happen after this, there's this like, burner phone cover up crazy meeting that happens in January 2020. And all of the journalists on the virology beat have to basically follow, they're sort of all guilty, they're all complicit. And the same thing, they all have to follow their sources. They're kind of slaves to these internal sources. The same is true, you've seen it, all over and over again on the intelligence beat. You'll see these people at the Times, the Post, that are basically creatures of certain agency sources, okay. And you're just like, with the State Department. So do we agree that problem's real? Maybe you don't think it's the biggest problem out there?
Yeah, so are reporters overly reliant on their sources? Definitely. Is it most apparent in the government? Absolutely. The Pentagon is the #1 problem there in that regard. If the Pentagon says it, the New York Times will print it. They almost never fact check government sources. And of course, second biggest problem, in my opinion, is the corporations. And you held up New York Times as an ideal.
Tell me how you think it works.
Hold on. One thing at a time. Okay. I'm going. You held up New York Times as kind of an ideal monarchy. I don't think it's ideal at all. I think it's unaccountable. I think it has massive problems. It smears people that are outsiders all the time. It protects the status quo.
I wasn't saying it was ideal. Let's
okay.
not. I'm
all
sorry.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
So if that's an example of monarchy, it sucks. And so,
yes.
But do I think that access is the number one problem? It's a massive problem. No, I do not think it's anywhere near the number one problem. So I can tell you what I think is the number one problem.
Corporate corruption. Yeah, tell me.
Yeah,
yes, we can at least agree to disagree.
Yeah. So what do major for-profit media companies care about? Profit. So there, I solved it. I'm a genius. And it is true of all companies. And when you question the press on it, they get real hurt. And they say, oh, are you saying, this sounds like a conspiracy theory that our giant multi-billion-dollar corporation would like to make money. Okay, yeah, that's my theory. And so what do? They suck up to their advertisers. Their advertisers are almost all corporations with one giant exception. Defense contractors, drug companies, bankers, you name it. So but their number one advertiser is not those guys. Their number one advertiser is politicians. Every 2 years, they dump billions of dollars into mainstream media. And in return, well, first of all, they got that money from other corporations. The corporations are sponsoring the politicians and the media. And in return, the Faustian bargain that mainstream media does is we will never talk about money in politics. We will not tell you that these politicians are corrupt and collecting millions of dollars of checks from corporations and serving them slavishly. We will pretend that that issue does not exist, and these are honorable gentlemen who are having honest debates. So what is corrupting the media? The answer is obvious, the money.
Can I agree with you about that and disagree in other ways? I feel like that's a critique that is basically very similar to the critiques of sort of pre-prestige journalism that a lot of people made, for example, in the 20s. And I think if you go back in the 20s and you basically compare the firewall between corporate and the news desk at like prestige, places. I'm talking about, I'm not talking about like Gannett or whatever, right? And that firewall has sort of only been built up more and more strongly as a matter of custom in the trade of journalism over the last 50, 60 years. Moreover, if for example, like a Facebook is controlling, the New York Times, they must be doing it wrong because I see anti-Facebook stories in there, 100 times a year, 50 times a year, whatever. So I don't know about, I think that more generally where that critique kind of hits the mark is that one of the things like politics has become this kind of, I don't know if you've noticed this, Cenk, but it's become a game show. Have you noticed that a game show quality has developed out there, right?
Led by some of your friends, but yes, for sure.
Yeah, absolutely, right. And and the thing is that basically whether that is sort of more proper to kind of, I mean, don't get me wrong, there is much that is just horrendous about Donald Trump. He's a grifter, but he's also a very talented comedian. And I think I think our next president should be as funny as Donald Trump.
Okay, so I hear you on that. We actually do talk about that. We think he is oftentimes unintentionally funny. He doesn't realize that he's being an idiot, and that the funny part is how stupid he is. But yes, we do often laugh at what Trump says. We laughed often at what Bush said. Nobody laughs at what anything Biden said. So I understand that, and that's a quality that can help you win an election.
Biden was funnier when he was younger. Biden was funnier when he was younger.
Yeah, I hear you. And he had a lot of gaffes that were also unintentionally funny. By the way, Facebook and New York Times, the New York Times does write anti-Facebook articles all the time because they're competitors. And so New York Times loves to attack new media, YouTube, Facebook. In fact, CNN did this a while back. We showed it on the Young Turks. They smeared YouTube and Facebook and said, "Oh my God, these awful people on these online things. You can't trust them at all." And then they sent out their advertising team to tell those same sponsors and advertisers, don't advertise on YouTube and Facebook, advertise on CNN instead. So they do hit jobs, and why is that? That's also connected to the money. So I'm curious though, if you call the cathedral, sure, we call it mainstream media or corporate media or establishment media. I laid out why I think they do it. I'm a little bit, main reason I brought you on is because I want to understand one another. So why do you think the cathedral or mainstream media does what they do? You're obviously unhappy with them. I think it's money, and I laid out how. What do you think is their purpose?
I think that these have become agencies of government that are essentially corrupted by power. I think most people have heard the great Lord Acton line, power corrupts, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I can't really think of anyone that the New York Times is accountable, besides Prince Salzburger the fifth or whatever. Because the Salzburger family, is in absolute. It's not, Wall Street doesn't control the Times. It's still under family control, which is amazing in the 21st century. But if you basically say, okay, let's forget about, here's an exercise you can go through. You can say, where is power located today in Washington? Power is always converged. It's always conserved. Somebody is always in power. So, and maybe it may not be in one point, like in a monarchy, it may be sort of distributed around. I don't think that, many of your readers would believe that we live in anything that in any sense could be called a democracy. So, let's call it what it is, which is an oligarchy. So where in this oligarchy is power located? So here's a thought experiment you can use to answer the question of where is power located. Suppose there are like space Nazis. And the space Nazis want to take over America. And what they can do is implant their little Nazi chips in the brains of maybe 5,000 people and get these people to pretend to be have their former progressive beliefs or whatever. Really inside they'll be Nazis and they'll be working for the Fifth Reich or whatever. And the question is, who do you put those chips in? And when you've answered the question of who you put the chips in, you've answered the question of who's in power, because that's all the Nazis want. They want power. And so if you imagine, you say, okay, do I put those chips in people who work at Google or people who work at the New York Times? Well, in that struggle, I'm going to bet on the New York Times, because if the New York Times finds out that Google is full of Nazis, the Nazis will get kicked out of Google. Whereas if Google finds out the Times is not accountable to anyone. And that sort of is kind of the definition of sovereignty. Henry VIII was not accountable to anyone. And so the question of when you have these agencies that aren't accountable to anyone, sort of why do they do what they do? Why do they all go in the same direction? Why weren't as why doesn't the prestige press, why is its position at year X always somewhere to the left of its position at year X minus 20? I remember the way people wrote about gay marriage in, say, 1990, it was this wild, crazy idea. And now it's obviously here to stay forever, right? And so, but at least ostensibly, everyone in 1990 was against it, and now they're for it. So that was sort of predictable in a way. Why did that happen? Why did these institutions, and when I say the cathedral, I group together the media and the universities. So there's a case that you could say, well, maybe since the New York Times always trusts Harvard on whatever the sciences or whatever, then maybe the Nazis should be at Harvard, and the New York Times will just trust it as they kind of, secretly work to bring about the Fifth Reich. But this is sort of a thought experiment that says, okay, where is the power located? And when we can see that basically the New York Times has a lot of unaccountable power, then we can start, even though it's not even mentioned in the Constitution, right? I would say it's easily as powerful as the Supreme Court, but it's nowhere in the Constitution. So how do you basically analyze a system that works that way in terms of basically the real structure of power?